The moon hung low, casting an eerie glow over the ghostly waters of the Caribbean, illuminating a haunting sight. The waves lapped gently, concealing whispers of the vanished. Crew members stood at the railings, gripping the wood tightly as a thick, unnatural fog rolled in, swallowing each ship one by one. Lanterns flickered, casting wavering shadows, as if warning of an ancient, restless spirit beneath the sea. Then, without warning, a chilling silence descended, a silence so complete it seemed to freeze time itself. What had seemed like a routine journey, carrying treasures from the New World back to Spain, quickly transformed into an unexplainable vanishing act. Crews had whispered of curses upon the treasure, and legends of divine retribution swirled through the Spanish Empire. But no one could have foreseen what awaited them. The fate of the fleet lay somewhere deep in the black depths, shielded by ancient mysteries and tales of revenge. This is the forgotten story of the ill-fated Spanish treasure fleet, a haunting journey into an enigma lost to time. In the spring of 1502, Spain's treasure fleet set sail from the New World, glittering with riches beyond imagining. It was a convoy of 14 heavily laden ships, under the command of Captain General Juan de Mendoza. Each vessel brimming with gold, silver, precious gems, and other priceless artifacts wrested from the Americas. The voyage back to Spain was long and treacherous, and tales of entire fleets lost to the sea were as common as the sight of seabirds circling the masts. But Mendoza was undeterred, confident that the riches in his hold were destined to secure Spain's legacy of empire. For the first few days, the fleet glided through the Caribbean, its ships tightly clustered like jewels scattered on a stretch of blue velvet. Spirits were high among the sailors. They had been promised rewards and titles upon their return to Spain, and dreams of wealth and glory filled their hearts. The weather too seemed to smile upon them. Gentle winds pushed them steadily westward, and the sun shone down from a cloudless sky. But as they pressed further into open waters, an uneasy quiet began to settle over the fleet. Sailors, who were normally filled with rowdy cheer, fell into hushed tones and anxious glances. They could not explain the change, but some swore they felt an unseen force watching them from beyond the horizon. The sea, which had been so welcoming, began to feel vast and indifferent, stretching out endlessly with no promise of safe harbour. On the fourth night, beneath a sliver of a moon, the first strange occurrence took place. A dense fog began to creep over the water, blanketing the ships and obscuring the stars. At first it seemed like an ordinary mist, but as the hours wore on, it grew thicker until visibility was reduced to mere feet. The men grew silent, staring out into the soupy darkness with a sense of foreboding. They could no longer see the ships nearest to them. Each vessel was isolated, suspended in an ethereal void. Captain Mendoza ordered his men to maintain their course, though it was near impossible to tell if they were moving in the right direction. Even the compasses, normally so reliable, began to spin erratically, as though some magnetic force within the mist was throwing them off. Mendoza, though uneasy, refused to let his men see his fear. He was a captain, a leader, and he would not let superstition undermine his authority. Yet that night, a sailor on the flagship reported seeing strange lights flickering in the fog, a sickly green glow that pulsed like the heartbeat of some terrible, unseen creature. Others saw shadows moving along the deck, and the faint sound of whispering voices, though they could not make out the words. Men crossed themselves, muttering prayers under their breath, and huddled together for warmth despite the heavy tropical air. Hours passed, and the fog grew colder, unnatural in its thickness. In the pre-dawn hours, a scream pierced the silence. It came from the Santa Isabel, a ship at the rear of the fleet. The men aboard Mendoza's ship turned in the direction of the sound, straining to see through the mist. Another scream followed, sharper and more desperate, before being abruptly cut off. The crew on the flagship waited, tense and fearful, but the Santa Isabel remained shrouded in fog, silent and unmoving. When dawn finally broke, the fog began to lift, and they looked in horror toward where the ship had been. There was nothing there. The Santa Isabel had vanished. Not a piece of driftwood, not a single scrap of sail remained. It was as if the ship had been swallowed whole. The men were shaken, but Mendoza forced them to press on. He reasoned that the fog was a natural phenomenon and that the Santa Isabel might have veered off course. Inwardly, though, he was as terrified as his men. The sea held many mysteries, and he was not arrogant enough to believe he understood them all. That night, as darkness fell, the fog returned, thicker than ever. One by one, ships began to disappear. A scream would echo through the mist, followed by silence, and by dawn another vessel would be gone. By the sixth day, half of the fleet had vanished, leaving only ghostly memories of their presence in the empty water. Some men began to whisper that the treasure they carried was cursed, that it had called forth vengeful spirits from the depths to reclaim what had been stolen. As the fleet dwindled, so did the crew's hope. They began to see things that defied explanation. Phantom ships gliding silently through the mist, pale figures standing on the water's surface, watching them with hollow eyes. Even the sea itself seemed to turn against them, churning with a restless fury that threatened to swallow them whole. On the seventh night, the fog lifted just enough for Mendoza to see the ghostly outline of a ship drifting toward them. It was one of their own, the San Cristobal, but something was horribly wrong. The sails were tattered, flapping in the wind like the wings of a dying bird, and the deck was eerily silent. Mendoza ordered his men to approach the ship, hoping to find survivors. As they boarded the San Cristobal, they found it deserted. The crew had vanished, leaving behind half-eaten meals and tools scattered across the deck. In the captain's cabin, Mendoza discovered a journal, the final entry scrawled in a frantic, shaky hand. "The fog is alive. It watches. It waits. We are not alone." Terror gripped the remaining sailors. They pleaded with Mendoza to abandon the treasure, to throw it overboard and end the curse. But Mendoza, driven by a mixture of greed and duty, refused. He believed they could still reach Spain, that the riches they carried were worth any price. He ordered the men back to their ships and resumed their journey. But the fog returned, thicker and colder than ever. That night, as they sailed through the darkness, a monstrous storm erupted out of nowhere. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the roiling sea, and thunder shook the ships to their very bones. The waves rose high, crashing over the decks and threatening to capsize them. In the midst of the storm, a terrible vision appeared before them. Through the sheets of rain and lightning, they saw a ship, a massive spectral vessel with tattered sails and ghostly figures lining its deck. Its hull was blackened and rotting, and its crew stared out with hollow, empty eyes. It was a ship of the dead, a harbinger of doom, and it seemed to call to them, beckoning them into the depths. The men screamed in terror, trying to steer away, but the spectral ship moved with unnatural speed, closing in on them. One by one, the ships were overtaken, disappearing into the storm, their crews lost to the dark, churning sea. By dawn, only Mendoza's ship remained. The storm had passed, and the sea was calm once more, as if the horrors of the night had been nothing but a nightmare. But the silence was broken by a final, chilling realization. Every other ship in the fleet was gone. Mendoza stood alone on the deck, the weight of the cursed treasure pressing down upon him like a shroud. For weeks Mendoza sailed alone, drifting through empty seas with no sign of land. He had run out of food and water, and his mind had begun to fray, haunted by the specters of his lost crew. In his delirium, he began to see them on the deck, their hollow eyes watching him, their voices whispering of betrayal and vengeance. On the final day, as his strength gave out, he looked down into the water and saw the ghostly reflection of a ship beneath him, a spectral fleet sailing in the depths, waiting for him to join them. With his last breath, he released the cursed treasure, letting it sink into the sea, hoping to appease the vengeful spirits that haunted him. And as the last piece of gold slipped beneath the waves, he felt a cold hand on his shoulder. He turned to see the ghostly captain of the spectral ship standing beside him, his hollow eyes filled with an eternal darkness. The fleet was never seen again, and the treasure remains lost to this day, hidden somewhere beneath the waves, guarded by the restless spirits of those who perished in the cursed voyage. Some say that on foggy nights, if you listen closely, you can still hear the mournful cries of the lost fleet echoing through the mist, calling out for release.